Thank you guys for so much for coming. This is an annual thing for LDG. My name is Ari. I am the events coordinator for Leatherman's discussion group. We are recording for YouTube right now. We're live on YouTube, I believe, right?
Live.
Okay, so keep it in your pants, you know. All right, and also if you take out your phones and silence them right now as well.
So Johnny.
I'm real talk.
I didn't even bring my phone.
Oh, see.
There's nothing to silence, except me.
Well, until prompted by other Dom, then yes. So, first off, thank you guys for coming out. We're going to have a break about 8:30 for about 10-15 minutes, and then we're going to run till about 9:30. And just a quick blurb of how the Leatherman Discussion Group's mission. First off, we've been around in the community since 1996, for our 26th year. So, yeah, you can clap for that. We have built strong community and educational and social programs for like-minded kinky men, but we're welcome and opening to all genders and all other creeds. We are an independent, all-volunteer 501c3 organization. Our programs feature guest speakers, themes, workshops, town halls, panel discussions every month surrounding sexuality, community, BDSM technique, spirituality, and we also have a young Leatherman's discussion group. So if you are interested in that, you can get a hold of one of the board members about that. And speaking of which, yes, do you have a question?
I'm a board member. I'm a board member. You can talk to me.
I'm just messing with him.
I'm a
Speaking
safe
of our board members, we have our tech guy and our marketing, Eric, here. And then we had who you met at the door, we had our treasurer, Rascal. And then we have two other board members who are out of town currently. Jay, who's our chairman and does our programming, and then Grunt, who's our secretary. All right, and also, right now we are also looking for board members as well. So if you're interested in joining us, it's a lot of fun. You get to know the community really, really well. You get to hang out with us. You got something I want to mess you back. But if you're interested, talk to either of the three of us, and we would love to give you more information about that. So also feel free to post about LDG on social media. We're on Twitter, we're on Facebook. Are we on Instagram?
No.
Okay. All right, and from here, I'm going to hand it over to Percy.
Okay, thank you, Art.
Okay.
So welcome everyone. It's really exciting to see a really packed house. So my name is Percy Castellanos. You're welcome to say Percy in Spanish or Percy in English. My pronouns are he, they. I'm a Mexican Salvadoran, child of immigrant parents, queer, polyamorous, and I'm a Kinkster. I also happen to be a therapist. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I've been in the mental health field for about 16 years, and I've been licensed in the state of California since 2014. Over the course of my career, I've served in a lot of different capacities. I was a volunteer on the National Suicide Crisis Line, worked in community mental health clinics, including with the severely mentally ill homeless population, as well as people living with HIV and AIDS. I worked in a psychiatric hospital with adolescents. I worked at a medical hospital where I supported folks with acute, chronic, and terminal illness, and that includes coronavirus. And the last year I've been in private practice. So I'm really excited to be here because it means a lot to me actually to be here because as a former mentee of the LDG program that really supported and fostered me in my growth as a Kinkster and as a therapist, it's wonderful to be here to give back as a kinky therapist. So I'm really grateful to the board, especially also including Cal for really leading the way and being a role model and mentor to me too. So in that same spirit, I really invite all of you to really bring a learner's perspective today. Maybe even consider reflecting or taking action toward your emotional and mental health. And being mindful that some of what I present today, it may apply to you or not, but it may also actually apply to a loved one, a family member, a coworker, or even a play partner. So while I'm up here as a therapist, this is not therapy, but it may actually prompt you to get connected. And some of the examples I've given, I'm really pulling from a lot of different, really kind of narratives, folks that I've known in my life as well. So what we're going to be kind of covering today is, I'm going to give you just some snapshots of some mental health key issues that we've been seeing over the last 3 years. I'm going to review some common signs and symptoms of mental health of these presentations. I'm going to review some mental health considerations for Kinksters, and then we're going to take a break. I'm going to go over some options for what you can do to respond to some of these issues. And I'm going to provide some brief resources. I'm going to have a Q&A, then I'm going to have a brief closing. I should say that the structure today is slightly different. I am, at the end of each segment, I'm going to open up briefly to questions. But I'm just going to see if you have any kind of brief clarifying questions. All right? Let's see. In order to make this presentation more accessible for the deaf, hard of hearing, and deafblind community, and to the folks who are neurodivergent, or folks who just want to read the description of today's presentation, I'm going to create a transcript, and I've asked that LDG upload it onto the website afterwards. Just to mention a trigger warning that I'm going to be talking about things today like suicide, depression, intimate partner violence. So really give yourself the permission to check with yourself if you need to get up, if you need to move to the back, take a break. If you're tuning in right now, if it's becoming a little too much, and you could always hit pause, take a step away. And in the event that you do need to check in, I have my sub David over in the corner. David, raise his hand, there we go. The intention of him being there is to actually check in with you in case you're walking out. So if you're going to the bathroom, just give him a thumbs up and let him know you're fine. Otherwise, we'll check in with you. A couple more things. I want to acknowledge that the land under our boots belongs to the Chochenyo, Ohlone, and Muwekma peoples. And today I'd like to dedicate this presentation to my friend Scott Blanks, who unfortunately passed away at the age of 34 on March 27, 2020. So I want to start off first with one of the first, so what I'm going to be reviewing now in these series of small, short snapshots is data for the general population as well as for the LGBT community, so we can see a little comparison. A little bit about what I've seen or what I'm seeing now, and some signs and symptoms of these issues. So we're going to cover mental illness, alcohol and substance abuse, suicide, intimate partner violence, and sexual activity. So let's get started with mental illness as the first one. So it was found from SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Act in 2020, that 1 out of every 5 U.S. adults experience mental illness. That includes depression, anxiety, trauma. And 1 out of every 20 experience severe mental illness, and that includes schizophrenia, bipolarity. It was found from the U.S. Census Bureau that the LGBTQ adults reported 2 times the rate of mental illness compared to non-LGBT people. Some of what I'm seeing right now is folks are actually quite confused about what they're experiencing because they've been through so much. And they're reporting a full range of different symptoms and not exactly sure why. So for that reason, I want to kind of review just some of these symptoms in these different areas. So depression. Depression is more than just sadness. It's actually an emotion, right? You could say, I feel depressed. It could be temporary, but it could also be a longer extended stay. So it's extreme sadness and despair. It's feeling worthless, hopeless. You could also become very irritable and have anger outbursts. It's lacking motivation and interest in things that you used to enjoy. It can also cause isolation. It can affect your memory, so concentration and memory problems. Lots of folks over the years, myself included, have been having memory issues. It's one of the unexpected symptoms. You can have low energy. It could also affect your sleep and appetite, either sleeping a lot more than usual, sleeping less, insomnia, or even having changes in your appetite. Clinically, a depressive episode lasts at least 2 weeks, at least for when we diagnose it. However, the average depressive episode lasts between 6 and 8 months. One thing I just want to say about depression or about all these symptoms is, I know I'm describing things that you likely see, but the reality is that we have an external state and an internal state. So externally, for example, I might seem, hey, I'm having a great time, I'm fine right now. Internally, I'm anxious, right? So we actually mask, we hide. And sometimes that mental energy is enough to kind of mask some of those symptoms, unfortunately. Next, I want to get to anxiety. So anxiety, I just want to say, all of us need anxiety. It actually helps us survive in the world, especially in dangerous situations or threats. But oftentimes anxiety becomes a problem when it's excessive worry that's hard to control. It could also present as muscle tension and avoidance. One of the more common presentations of anxiety is what we call generalized anxiety, and that's when you worry about most things, but also presents with restlessness, being on edge, or easily fatigued, as well as similar to depression, concentration issues, and sleep issues. So you're starting to see maybe some overlap right in what I'm describing. Another common presentation is panic attacks. These isn't necessarily isolated just to anxiety. It could happen or occur in any other kind of condition or mental health issue. But a panic attack is a sudden, overwhelming fear that lasts minutes. Next, I want to cover trauma. So trauma is the emotional response to a terrible event. It can happen if it's directly happening to you. It can happen if you're witnessing it. It can also happen if you learn of it impacting a loved one or someone you care about. So often in the beginning, it can start off as shock and denial, but long term it can cause strained relationships, unpredictable emotions, physical symptoms like nausea and headache, as well as contribute to something you might be familiar with, which is flashbacks and avoidance. Just to clarify what a flashback is, most folks assume that it's an image that flashes. It's not always that. It could be an image that comes up. It could also be a physical sensation that you can experience. So that's where sometimes you may not exactly know. It can be a little confusing for folks. You may not know that that's actually that reaction or feeling is connected to memory. And the last one I just want to touch on, this one is not in the DSM. The DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders that we use. But this one, a therapist coined it during the pandemic. Their name is Owen O'Kane, and it's post-pandemic stress disorder. It includes fear of exposure, infection, quarantine, lockdown, job loss, loneliness, loss of social life. I know I've been there. So now I want to move on to the next snapshot. This one we're going to be covering alcohol and substance abuse. So SAMHSA found that in the general population during the pandemic, 1 out of every 15 adults reported to experience both mental illness and substance abuse. Overall, among adults, they saw a slight increase in use, around 10 to 15%. And I found a study that looked specifically at the LGBT community, and it was kind of across the board. For alcohol, they found that there was a group around 30% who increased their use. They found that there was around 30% who decreased their use, and there was another about 30% who stayed the same. Around substance use, they actually found it was slightly different. It was around 20% of folks reported an increase in their use. Around 30% reported a decrease in their use, and about 50, around 50% stayed the same. So what I'm starting to see now is that people have a different tolerance than they did before. Tolerance is how much can you, again, tolerate it. The amount that you're drinking causes intoxication or causes that high. So there's often, I think right now, so many of us are, or we have been, experiencing this desire to be our former selves again, to kind of go back to our usual self. And that, unfortunately, I think that desire is influencing how much we're using. I'll just share a brief story of someone who just went out, and it was a really great event that had been postponed during the pandemic. They were with friends celebrating, and they drank the way they used to drink before the pandemic. Their tolerance is here. Their tolerance is here. Another tolerance is here. And what happened, right? Withdrawal. They had a horrible hangover, anxiety when they were drinking. And of course, that causes a sense of shame and guilt about what happened. So now I want to look at what are some signs of alcohol and substance abuse. So, and one thing to be mindful of, everything that I'm recording right now, or naming, let's not focus on the specific symptom or the specific presentation. It's usually a cluster. There are many of them kind of together. So first one is physical. So there may be tremors, slurred speech, or coordination problems. There could also be a deterioration in appearance. There could be sudden weight loss or weight gain, bloodshot eyes, or different sized pupils, larger or smaller. Psychologically, there could be unusual periods of increased energy, nervousness or instability, sudden mood swings, appearing fearful, anxious, or paranoid without reason. Behaviorally, there's usually an increased tolerance. Life revolves around the alcohol or the substance. You continue to use despite the negative consequences. And you often use the same substance to relieve the hangover. So an example is if you drink a lot the night before, the next day you have a hangover, then you're drinking a little bit more to kind of leave it off. It can sometimes become a habit. Moving on now to another topic, which is suicide. So SAMHSA found that in the general population during the pandemic, 12 million adults had serious thoughts of suicide. Now there were some reports, there's a report from the CDC that says that suicide rates overall dropped. You may have seen that report. That report does not really doesn't capture all the subgroups or populations. There was a drop in rates, primarily among women and men 35 and older. However, there were some subgroups who actually saw an increase, and that was among, I'm using these terms because they were part of the report, Hispanic men, non-Hispanic black men, and non-Hispanic American Indians. Now going to touch on the LGBT community, I did quite a bit of searching online for data on this, and just to say that we're not always represented in the data. We've existed for so long, and yet they don't really even ask whether it's gender identity or sexual orientation. So we know, that's why I'm kind of talking about what I'm seeing, because it's really hard we're not being represented. There was one study just before the pandemic that I just do want to highlight though. It said that overall the LGBT community is between 3 and 6 times at greater risk of suicide. And there was among that group, they found that 5% among gay and bi men, they found that 5% had reported suicide ideation. 15% had reported suicidal ideation, 5% had a plan, and about 2% had attempted. So some of what I'm seeing right now, right now we just went through a time change. Daylight savings. We're also approaching winter, so we have less time in the day, and this is a very common time for something that we call seasonal affective disorder, or seasonal affective symptoms. So if you're prone to depression, then the seasonal changes can actually affect your mood. So I'm starting to see actually the suicidal thoughts starting to creep in a little bit more because of the depression. And again, going back to kind of what I said before, folks are kind of confused about what they're going through. So they're experiencing this on top of everything that we've been through over the last few years. So what are some signs and what are some warning signs of suicide risk? I'm going to cover serious risk and imminent risk. Serious risk is talking about being trapped or in an unbearable situation, talking about being a burden to others, and increased use of drugs or alcohol. And as you heard earlier, there's been shifts, right, in terms of use. Immediate risk includes talking about wanting to die or kill yourself, looking for a way to kill yourself, and talking about feeling hopeless or not having a reason to live. So we're going to move on now to intimate partner violence. So the American Journal of Emergency Medicine found that during the pandemic, global rates of intimate partner violence increased between 23 and 33%. Specifically among the LGBT community, the HR Human Rights Campaign, along with another research organization, found that in general, that the LGBT community, we are 2 times more likely to experience intimate partner violence. And among those who were experiencing, amongst 77% of LGBT people experiencing intimate partner violence said that the frequency increased during the pandemic. So here's a little bit about what I'm seeing. Right now, folks are reevaluating their relationships. There were lots of folks who had to move in together out of survival. And they adapted. They spent lots of time together under a great deal of stress. And some of that contributed to some of those episodes. Right now, as the world is slowly opening up again, or it's open, right? But as we're returning to this new normal, routines are changing, and with that, it means that people are in different places. Some folks aren't really ready to kind of open up fully as they were before. And others might think about maybe a couple, polycule. There's all these different needs, wants, work, situations. So that's actually causing some need for extra negotiation as well as some conflicts. And earlier, as I mentioned, the rates of substance use, what I'm also seeing is how alcohol and the desire to want to get back out there and be your former self and go to bars and socialize the same way as before is actually leading to more fights, which thus then increases the chance of violence. So I'm going to review some of the warning signs of intimate partner. I should say that abuse could come in many, many forms. It could be physical, it could be emotional, psychological, it could be sexual, financial, legal, and spiritual. Hitting, slapping, punching, shoving, kicking, biting, choking during an argument. Hence, during an argument, not during a scene, a consensual scene. An argument. Belittling you for your sexual orientation or gender identity. Distorting the acts of abuse, like that's the way gay relationships are. Threatening to out or expose you for your sexual orientation, gender identity, your HIV status, your legal status, maybe even your kink identity. Forcing or coercing you into doing things you do not want to do sexually. Preventing you from having or keeping a job or education. Using fear of police against you to prevent you from getting help. Threatening to hurt or kill themselves if you leave or you do not comply with wishes. And the last point, I just want to mention, so when I worked at Kaiser Permanente during the pandemic, I served on the Family Violence Prevention Committee. We looked at rates of family violence, so for children, adults, children, adolescents, adults, and elderly. This is data more from among victims who identify as women, but I still want to share this. We found that in the emergency rooms, the data shows that if there is strangulation, choking, involved in an episode of abuse, your risk of being killed or murdered significantly increases. Your risk of the offender hurting children in the house significantly increases. The risk of police being hurt or some altercation happening significantly increases. So in the event, I'll get to this later, but if that's happening, the risk is significantly increased. So there's be mindful. All right, take a little breath. I know I'm coming a lot right now. So the last snapshot I want to get to is sex, the fun one. So, so overall, in the general population, it was found that COVID-19 restrictions did correlate with an increase of sexual dysfunction and a decrease of sexual activity. That's in the general population. It was mainly found among older adults, women, men, and then levels of education also vary that too. There were 2 studies I found that focused on the LGBT community. So overall among all orientations, sexual behavior decreased during the pandemic. Except it increased based on 2 factors. 1, if you were partnered or married, and 2, if you were based on your living situation. So if you were living with your partner, roommate, or a special friend. Another study, though, actually found that among gay and bisexual men, there was a slight increase among sexual partners, around between 2.3%. So some of that data, again, be mindful of how much are represented. There's just mixed presentations. So some of what I'm seeing right now is that, like I said before, people really want to get back out there, especially sexually. They want to get back into their kinks, want to get back into their fun. But with that comes anxiety, issues with performance, insecurities. Because of changes to the physicality, oftentimes, maybe the gears fitting more loose, maybe the gears fitting more tight, due to mental health symptoms or different mental and emotional capacity. And that is contributing to a lot of sense of shame, disappointment, and embarrassment. So what are some common sex-related problems? And I should just say that these are not problems for everyone, but this is the way that they're classified. Lack of interest and desire for sex, inability to become aroused, difficulty having an erection, not if you're caged or locked for no pain during sex or inability to have penetrative sex, difficulty getting or keeping an erection, again, premature ejaculation. And the last one, I just want to note, there's different perspectives on this one from different professional organizations, but just want to put it out there as an option if it is an issue, but compulsive sexual behavior. So I just reviewed several different snapshots. I'm curious if you have any kind of brief clarifying questions for me.
Thanks so much. I just have a question regarding the way you're defining sexual in this context is necessarily involving more than one person. And if you, this might be for the Q&A portion, but just if you have perspectives on the pandemic allowing people to increase their sexual relationships and desire with themselves and explore their fetishes and kinks on their own.
That's a great question. I think based on the way I define it, I should say based on the data, I didn't see the specific definition. That's a really great question. When I was referring to it, I was referring to it with other people. I'm not exactly, based on the reports that I saw, I didn't see that exactly clarified. If anything, with video, there are new sexual practices that have to be introduced. Not new ones, but some that kind of we use more often. Glory holes, videos, distance, right? Circle jerks, distance, circle jerks, whatever it is. I don't remember seeing that in the data. Or that defined. Did I answer that question?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Any other brief clarifying questions?
You mentioned that sexual dysfunction increased. I'm not familiar with that term. What is sexual dysfunction?
Great question. That is that I should clarify. So in the research, it was defined as sexual dysfunction. I clarified and I said sex-related problems. So the ones that I listed, like lack of interest or desire of sex, difficulty having an erection, whatever problems. Yeah. Does that answer the question? All right, we're going to move on to the next segment. All right, now we're going to move on to mental health considerations for Kinksters. So the first thing I want to say is being kinky does not inherently make you mentally ill. But like the general population, our community does have people who live with mental illness and mental health symptoms. And during the pandemic, queer Kinksters likely faced more mental health stressors than the general population. That was stacked on top of stigma, harassment, discrimination, and minority stress that existed pre-pandemic. And in addition to that, some of the health disparities that we saw, challenges of housing, food security, which worsened during the pandemic. So not only did we face lockdown, quarantine, different COVID variants, but we also faced the threat of monkeypox, a disfiguring disease that for some brought back traumatic memories of the early AIDS epidemic. In the similar spirit of that time, we educated, we acted, we abstained, we vaccinated again, in order to overcome that threat in time to celebrate Folsom. So I think it's important to see our strength as a community in the face of adversity. There was a study conducted by the Kaiser Family Foundation. They looked at the LGBT community, LGBT folks versus non-LGBT folks. They found that among our community, we were more likely to follow protocols, more likely to get vaccinated, because we were protecting others. We also have some examples here of folks that really pulled together to really keep us connected. I think about Master Ito, who organized virtual leather lounge and connected folks all over the world. I think about LDG, who continue to provide some programming to give us some sense of familiarity. I also think about Master Yi, who now, as we're returning to normal, has re-inspired or reorganized Love SF, and even identified roles of ambassadors to be there to really help folks and welcome them in if they're new to. So a lot of strength within this room and within our community. So the pandemic impacted nearly every dimension of our lives, but that impact varied. We were in the same storm, but in different boats. Our relationship to time, distance, 6 feet, people, places, identity, and play may have changed, and we adapted out of option, obligation, or even survival. This means that our needs, our wants, capacity, tolerance, and limits may have changed. So whether kink is an activity, a lifestyle, or both, I really invite you to be curious about what and how did these things change or stay the same for you, regarding your mental health, your kink identity, your relationship, and even your play. There's a famous psychotherapist, her name is Esther Perel, and she was interviewed during the pandemic, and she identified the pandemic as being an accelerator, meaning that we're confronted with great adversity, we're forced to look inward. And some folks hunkered down, while others said, fuck it, I need to change. So here's some of what I'm seeing right now. As I mentioned before, people are trying to make up for lost time. They're trying to get back into events, get back into play. In some cases, unfortunately, their twosome is becoming an orgy because depression, anxiety, and trauma have joined them in the room without them being really aware of it. Folks are actually being hard on themselves because of their depression and their anxiety, their lack of play, creating, maybe backtracking some of their limits. There's shame, there's guilt, because they can't perform at the same level as pre-pandemic. There are also some folks questioning their kink identity. Some doms want to be sub, some subs want to be dom or switches, and some people are even stepping away just because they had quite a break. In society, in general, there's this push to want more, to do more, and that also trickles down into the kink community, and it gets internalized. So be more productive, make more money, gain more muscle, get more likes, more followers, take more pain, take more dicks, take more piss, be the most apex alpha, be the lowest submissive. There's also a push that almost I need to know what I like, what I want and like. And unfortunately that can sometimes be pressured with what are you into? Or what are your hard and soft limits? They're great questions, but if you don't know, that is almost an expectation. So I want you to notice how how the following influence your expectations in and out of the bedroom. The norm to want more, do more, or absolutely no. Societal peer or social pressure. The desire to please or to fit in. And even the construct of what it should mean to be a dom, sub, or switch. Here we have great examples in our community of folks challenging a lot of this. So I want to give a quick personal example and story that highlights honoring limits. So while I was in the LDG program, I was really excited to explore as many kinks as I could. And they actually had a needle play demo over at Mr. X. So I went in excited. I sat in the front row, I was watching the needles go through, I was fine. And then they asked us to actually stand up and watch from a different angle. And then suddenly as I stood up and stood there and watched, all of a sudden I felt nauseous. I felt dizzy. I got cold. I felt weak in my legs. I thought, what the fuck is happening to me? I've never had this before. And in that moment, a lot of these factors actually came in. I thought, one, is anyone else going through this? I'm standing out, is anyone noticing me? Two, I'm like, I don't want to disrupt the scene. I'm going to disappoint people if I fall over. But in that moment, I decided, like, something's going on. And so I pretended someone called me, and so I put out my phone, and I walked down the stairs, and as I'm walking, I'm like, we call the term noodle legs. It's where you can't stand, your legs don't support weight. It's actually a part of anxiety. And so I'm walking down the stairs, like holding onto the rails, and I call someone. And so I took time to kind of check in, and what was happening to me was a hypoarousal response. So I'll just say in anxiety, in the nervous system, we have you can imagine this, so just to define it generally, we have like a general baseline, but then there's a hyperarousal, which is what the common symptoms of anxiety, like increased heart rate, sweating, heart palpitation, and then there's actually the opposite, and which would feel kind of more disconnected, flowy, nauseous. Some of them are kind of, you can find some of the same kind of reactions in both. So in that moment, I realized what was happening. I was pretty much at a yellow, green, yellow, red, right? I was at a yellow. But I thought, you know what, in our community, we have this norm of try it once, try it twice, maybe try it again, and maybe try it with something different. So I said, you know what, I'm grounding, I'm present, let me try it again. So I felt better, I went back in, and what do you think what happened? The same thing. So here I was like, okay, I tried it, I gave myself permission, and then the break came, and I said, I'm gonna head out. So with that being said, I think it's important that we be cautious or be conscious of our mental, emotional state, our needs as you approach kink identity relationships and play. For this next piece, I really want to present I'll just say, like, there's a lot, in our community we talk a lot about RACK. Can someone tell me what RACK stands for? R-A-C-K? Right, yeah, risk-aware consensual kink. That's right. I'm going to add a letter to that and make it BRAC. So benefit and risk-aware consensual kink, because there's a lot of benefits that we can gain from our play. So I'm going to review some of the benefits and risks that can maybe occur in scenes. So the first, like dialectic, opposites I should say, that's just a clinical term, is engagement and disengagement. So one of the benefits that I would say is from play is greater engagement. You're feeling more excited, you're enthusiastic, you're enjoying what's happening, you're even looking forward to this, maybe doing it again. Disengagement may look like disliking something, being more apathetic. There could be increased mental distance from kink. There could be more of a negativism. And one thing that I just want to say is a fairly simple one, but it's in general. That one you kind of can get just from whatever kink you try, you might notice what you like, what you don't like. Another dialectic I want to present is dom sub high, and then the drop. So the high I'm just going to call headspace because there's subspace, dom space, etc. So that high can be defined more as euphoria, a flow state, a trust, a connectedness, a sense of being seen by your play partner or play partners, or even in yourself. The drop, I just want to define as temporary low feelings after a scene. It can present as feelings of depression, guilt, grief, disappointment. Some of the signs can present a few days, sometimes maybe shortly after the scene, a few days later, maybe even weeks. You could also feel like a missing of that mental state. And one thing just to emphasize is bringing in some of the mental health considerations. When we're in a scene and we're feeling that euphoria, there's a lot of chemical activation in the body, adrenaline. So I'm just gonna say, if you're experiencing like a depressive episode, you're lower energy, that scene might actually feel like, hey, it's elevating you for temporarily, but then what happens after the scene? You kind of drop back. You may not necessarily drop back to where you were, depends on the scene and some of these other factors. You may actually even drop lower, depending on what you're experiencing. Another benefit or risk is what I call moral comfort. There's another term that's out in the literature called moral injury. So moral comfort is what I would say is your sense of self is secure and grounded in your morals and your values, and that the kink or play that you're doing is in line with that. Moral injury, on the other hand, is acting or witnessing behaviors that go against your values or your norms. This term is primarily used to define war veterans because they're in situations that are inescapable and they feel forced to do things they don't want to do, and thus there's that moral injury, or it could be stemming from trauma. But I wanted to integrate that here. Oftentimes, moral injury happens because of a transgression against yourself or even from someone else. And as I mentioned, there could be a sense of inescapability as well as shame and distress. So the example that I gave earlier about my story of needle play, if I had tolerated that, what might have happened emotionally to me, right? Maybe a moral injury, maybe a transgression of I'm sticking in the scene because I need to be here. So be mindful of that. Another dialectic would be regression. So regression, I'm putting it in both terms. So regression is voluntary at times. It's essentially a reversion to a younger mental state in order to feel secure, safe, and comfortable. Any scene you can, actually outside of the bedroom, we could do this. We can access that regression in order to respond to a stress or a situation. But in the bedroom, it can actually be applied to any scene. But I noticed that, again, this benefit or this regression is actually more accessed, more so in H play, maybe DL play. And there's a sense of accessing that part of you, bringing it, and then hopefully integrating it. Sometimes that regression can happen involuntarily, and that's the risk. In this way, it's a defense mechanism. It's a form of escape in order to cope. And some of the signs of that are crying, becoming mute, like not speaking, baby talk, rocking, going into a fetal position, or even having a bit of a, what they call tantrum. And lastly, I want to touch on another dialectic, which is post-traumatic growth and post-traumatic stress disorder, or trauma. So post-traumatic growth, it's a sense of empowerment. It's a sense of strength, meaning in relating to yourself and others. There's an appreciation for life. There's new possibilities, and even spiritual security. Whereas trauma, which is what I described before, is fear, disillusionment, stress, low sense of self, it can occur from boundary crossing or violations or even triggers. All right. So, I want to open it up to some questions. I know we're going to be taking a break shortly, but just briefly before we go on break, any questions about what I've said so far?
So I don't know too much about this, but I've heard that a lot of these terms were first used for like veterans, wartime, lots of heavy symptoms noticed in those people. So what are some of the similarities or differences between this, these words and terminologies for veterans and people who have experienced those like very extreme circumstances versus people who maybe also feel very extreme emotion but are like in the civilian populace?
So is what you're asking, like you mentioned, what is the difference between what, let's say, war veterans went through in those extreme situations?
Yeah,
And
are there any differences or similarities or things like that?
yeah, no, that's a great question. One thing I'd say is, again, so this is why there's a lot of healthy criticism of our DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. So usually trauma is defined by, earlier what I said is you directly experiencing something, you also witnessing something, as well as learning of something happening to a loved one. Typically it involves a life-threatening situation or something that also affects your dignity. The reality is there's a lot more experiences that can be considered traumatic. And in our community, we talk about big T traumas, which is, let's say, like a war. We also talk about little T traumas, and those are, let's say, microaggressions, right, over throughout your life, or being stereotyped, or the homophobia, daily microaggressions, let's say homophobia, for example, and those stack. Oftentimes they can present differently. I think when we think about trauma, sometimes we think about like extreme presentations, almost like dissociation, which is like you're just disconnected, you're zoned out, you're not really responding to anyone around you. You also think about someone who's really hypervigilant and on edge, and like really eyes are wide and really worried. But actually, the other ways of trauma we don't often notice, it's sometimes that masking that comes in. It's oh, something's happening, and it's responding in different ways. I'll just say that we have this terminology from the central nervous system. There's different responses: fight, flight, freeze, fawn. Let's say, am I thinking faint? So fight, flight, freeze, fawn. Okay? Essentially, there are different responses that can come up, and they can present differently in the body. Ultimately, did I answer that question?
Yeah, I think you helped a lot. Thanks.
All right. Any other questions?
Kind of a hard question. Dealing with someone who may have suicidal thoughts, I mean, how could we recognize that in people in our social circle and help them? Because sometimes I hear people are surprised that they didn't know someone was suffering and boom, they're gone. And it's like, well, then it's too late to help.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I'm looking back at just some of the more obvious, kind of more I should say not obvious, more easily identifiable signs. So earlier I mentioned some of the risks are talking about being trapped or in unbearable pain, as well as talking about being a burden to others, as well as increased use of drug or alcohol. I identified some of them. There's more warning signs to that. But sometimes it's if you notice that second one, someone saying that they feel like they're a burden. Clinically, for therapists, we're trained to pick up on that. If someone's presenting, like if they're showing like they're more sad, they're more withdrawn, they're talking more negatively about themselves. For us, we're trained to kind of catch that and kind of check in and ask that question. Unfortunately, it's not always that easy to kind of notice those signs, those presentations in people. And then on top of that, to say that, going back to what I mentioned about internal state and external state, oftentimes what can happen is inside you could be you could be depressed, and then externally you're saying, hey, everything's great, I'm fine. There's literature on something called high functioning depression, and this is someone who can actually get a lot done in a day. But so maybe go to the gym in the morning, maybe go to work, and be really productive. But then afterwards, the depression kicks in more, and then inside you're still feeling some of those symptoms, worthlessness, hopelessness. But oftentimes they're accessing that energy, their nervous system, to kind of keep pushing them through to get more done. So unfortunately, I think that that's a presentation of, again, someone going through that, but then potentially masking that. I would just say, like, in our culture, there's this really common greeting is, how are you? It's actually not a question. It's also the same thing in Spanish, like, ¿cómo estás? Bien. We just say it. But really, when we ask that question, like, really, tell me, how are you? Right? Tell me one, and from that we can actually ask other questions, like, tell me one thing that went well in your day. What's something that went, that was bad or you didn't like? When we ask those more specific questions, it can actually give us a greater gauge. So if I ask the question, like, tell me one thing that went well. Nothing. What's something that's going bad? Everything. That gives us a little bit more of a sense than just fine, because fine is, what is fine? I'm not fine. So, did I answer that question?
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions, folks?
Did you speak to body dysmorphia?
I'm sorry?
Body dysmorphia?
Yeah, the question is about body dysmorphia. Oh, I'm being tested here to remember clinical, the DSM. My understanding of body dysmorphia is when you're feeling increased negative perceptions of your body, entirely or even parts of your body. It can often cause a lot of great distress in folks. There'd be a lot of fixation on certain parts, like arms or nose or penis or whatever, right? External genitalia, I should say. And so usually there could be, again, a mental fixation on it, as well as maybe even some behaviors or activities that revolve around trying to make that part, like, better, I guess. Did I kind of answer that question?
Somewhat.
Somewhat. I'm wondering, Cal, do you have anything to say about that, by chance?
I don't know statistics, but I do remember reading that there's definitely a higher incidence of body dysmorphia in the gay and trans cultures than in the population at large. And it's often exactly as you described it, I think, a negative perception of self. Sometimes it's also just a difference. Like when you look in the mirror, what you see is different than when other people look at you. And it can also be that when you look at yourself and see something, if you saw the same thing in someone else, you would say, oh, they look great. But when you look at it in yourself, you say, oh, I need to work on that. So it's those kinds of, I don't want to call them misperceptions, but differences in perceptions in terms of how you look at yourself versus how you might look at others or how others might look at you.
The reason I ask is I learned when I was 29 that I had Klinefelter syndrome and how that's affected me all through my life.
Absolutely, and there's a lot of, that I was thinking back to one. Thank you, Cal, for helping clarify that. I mentioned earlier that I worked a lot with folks with acute chronic terminal illness, things like cancer, amputations, thyroid issues, let's say hyperthyroidism, can really change our body sometimes, right? And especially when going back to that idea, like what are we seeing in society, what are the pressures, it's being look a certain way, right? Gain that muscle, eat this way, and that creates that disappointment sometimes, depending on the sense of self-image. One thing I want to emphasize of that, so thank you for that question, is I'm thinking a little bit about, I was talking to someone recently that actually they actually experienced body euphoria because after some time, during the pandemic, their gear wasn't fitting as well, and they decided, you know what, I'm going to start embracing this. And they put on their gear, actually at home, and then they started going out to events and saying, you know what, I'm going to try to embrace this. And then they started experiencing a little bit more of that. And frankly, sometimes what I say is like, if you're thinking that if the folks that you're around aren't attracted to kind of, let's say, a certain body feature or the way you look, go find folks that are. There's a huge range of interests and turn on fantasy that, again, I think there's just a lot of flavors out there. Any last questions before we go on break, folks? Going once, going twice. All right, we're on break.